David Lynch had one of the strangest, most unmistakable styles in film history. Small-town America mixed with pure nightmare fuel. Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive, and of course Twin Peaks, which somehow turned his brand of weirdness into a mainstream TV hit. But there was a weird moment in his career. Right after Eraserhead in 1977 and The Elephant Man in 1980, and before the Dune disaster in 1984, when Hollywood wasn't quite sure what to do with him. Eraserhead was a critically acclaimed body horror film. The Elephant Man got 8 Oscar nominations, and suddenly, studios thought Lynch could do anything. And they really threw everything at him. Oscar-bait dramas, big-budget blockbusters, even a high school comedy. Here are the 6 classic movies David Lynch almost directed. Star Wars might be one of the biggest franchises on the planet now, but back in the early 80s, George Lucas was still calling the shots on his own terms. After The Empire Strikes Back, he wanted full creative control again. Working with Irvin Kershner had been frustrating, and he wasn't about to hand over the reins without a fight. The big question was, go bigger and more action-heavy, or take Star Wars in a completely different, more experimental direction. Lucas considered a lot of directors, Steven Spielberg, Peter Weir, but the one he actually tried to lock down was David Lynch. Lynch had a few one-on-one meetings with Lucas, and while he respected him, he had almost no interest in doing it. He was deep into his own passion project, Johnny Rocket, which never ended up happening. Years later, Lynch said he liked Lucas, but just wasn't the right guy for the job. In his own words, "I had next to zero interest. George does what he loves, I do what I love. The difference is, what George loves makes hundreds of billions of dollars." With Lynch out, Lucas handed the movie to Welsh director Richard Marquand, and the trilogy got its ending. Horton Foote had already won an Oscar for To Kill a Mockingbird when he wrote Tender Mercies. It's a quiet, personal story about a country singer at rock bottom drinking himself into oblivion. Then he meets a young widow and her son, and for the first time in years, he has something to hold on to. For some reason, David Lynch was one of the first directors they considered. Even he had no clue why. In his memoir, Room to Dream, he admitted the film wasn't right for him, but he still called it a great film. This rather gentle movie may seem like the furthest thing one would associate with Lynch, but I personally think that David Lynch could have done a good job with it. Tender Mercies is a film that feels like it might be distantly related to the straight story, and Lynch's unapologetic love of Americana would have served the story well. Instead, the job went to Australian director Bruce Beresford. The movie was a critical hit. Foote won his second Oscar for the screenplay, and Robert Duvall took home Best Actor. And Lenny Von Dolen, who played a small role in Tender Mercies, later played the shut-in who had Laura Palmer's diary in Twin Peaks. Lynch was almost the director of Frances, a heavily fictionalized biopic about 1940s actress Frances Farmer. It sounds random, but it actually made sense. Jonathan Sanger and Mel Brooks, the producers of The Elephant Man, were behind it. Lynch was interested. The script focused on Farmer's time in a psychiatric ward, and there was a lot of room for him to play with surreal visuals and that eerie, dreamlike style he's known for. But in the end, he passed. Graham Clifford ended up directing, and Jessica Lange took the lead. The film ended up with 2 Oscar nominations, one for Lange and another for Kim Stanley in a supporting role. Of all the movies David Lynch was asked to direct, Fast Times at Ridgemont High has to be the weirdest. A high school slacker comedy about pot-smoking surfers is not exactly Eraserhead. The script, written by future Almost Famous director Cameron Crowe, had nothing in common with Lynch's work. You'd think he would have passed on it immediately, but he actually met with Crowe twice. Crowe later said Lynch sat there listening with a wry smile, then went off to read the script. When they met again, Lynch was as polite as ever, but clearly confused about why they even thought of him for the job. In the end, he told Crowe it was a great story, just not his kind of thing. Then he wished him luck, got in his Volkswagen, and drove off. Years later, Crowe ran into Lynch and brought up their meeting. Lynch actually remembered it, and Crowe thought that was pretty great. David Lynch was almost the first director to bring Hannibal Lecter to the screen. Manhunter was based on Red Dragon, Thomas Harris's 1981 thriller, and producer Richard N. Roth wanted Lynch to direct. For a while, he was on board, until he wasn't. Lynch later told Rolling Stone that he just got sick of it. No creative differences, no studio drama, he just hated the subject matter. I was going into a world that was going to be, for me, real violent and completely degenerate, he said. No redeeming qualities. The way I was thinking of it, I didn't want to let it into my country club. Michael Mann took over instead, casting Brian Cox as Lecter. The movie bombed at the box office and didn't stand a chance once The Silence of the Lambs came along. Just one quick thought though. This was also Michael Mann's third feature film, and by far and away his most stylish, accomplished, atmospheric, and technically brilliant to date. David Lynch passing on Halloween 2 isn't exactly a shock. He's never been into straight-up slasher violence. But for a brief moment, it looked like he was actually going to direct it. In 1980, the LA Times reported Halloween 2, which Carpenter will oversee, will be made with David Lynch. Box Office Magazine even confirmed it in early 1981. How serious was he about doing it? No one really knows. At the time, he had just finished The Elephant Man, a movie that completely changed his career. He went from directing weird midnight movies to working with Anthony Hopkins and getting Oscar buzz. He was even being courted for Star Wars, which would have made him more money than Halloween 2's entire budget. Meanwhile, Halloween had become the biggest indie success of all time, pulling in $70 million off a tiny budget. A sequel was inevitable, but Lynch wasn't the guy to make it happen. Instead, Rick Rosenthal took over for his directorial debut. The movie made money, but critics ripped it apart. Lynch's brief connection to Halloween 2 might have put him on Dino De Laurentiis' radar, which led to Dune. And even though Lynch never made the film, John Carpenter still liked him. The two apparently ran into each other at Bob's Big Boy in LA from time to time. We discussed whether the Pappy Parker's fried chicken is better than the Bob's Combo plate, Carpenter said. We never talked about movies.